Hi everybody, so I'll just let the panellists settle in. So I'm Beth Robotham. I am a bit of a wellbeing geek. I was an HR practitioner in wellbeing for 10 years, as Phil mentioned, so I understand how difficult it is to get momentum on wellbeing going, how difficult it is to evolve the programme, so we're not going to sidestep any of the tough questions. And I'm logged into Slido as well, so I can see some of the questions we had before, and we'll try and bring some of those in because I think we'll get some great insight from this group. So before we start, let's just get brief introductions from everybody, just so you can get a sense of the seniority and the experience of this group, because I think it's a fantastic panel. So, Paul, would you kick us off, please?
Thanks so much, Beth. My name is Paul Litchfield. I'm the Chief Medical Officer and Director of Health, Safety and Wellbeing at BT, and I'm seconded on a part-time basis to chair the relatively new What Works Centre for Wellbeing, which is something the Prime Minister asked to be set up that's looking at pulling the evidence base together for wellbeing.
Hello, Melanie Gurney. I'm Executive Director and Head of L&D for Mizuho International. Mizuho International is a Japanese organisation, part of the Mizuho financial group, which is about 60,000 people worldwide. We're the financial services investment banking arm in London.
Hello, my name's Steve Bell. I'm the CEO of Iris. I feel a slight fraud sitting on this panel because I'm not a psychologist, a doctor, or anything to do with HR. But I'm the CEO and the founding partner of an agency called Iris. We've got about 1,000 people around the world. We are an advertising agency and we develop creative ideas for clients such as Adidas, Samsung, Barclaycard, Shell. So it's very much a young person's industry where attracting talent is by far the hardest and most challenging thing that we have. And I think that would be an interesting thing to talk about later in terms of wellness and well-being.
Brilliant. So before we get started, I often refer to Paul as the godfather of wellbeing, but not often in front of him. So we'll see how he feels about it today. But Paul, I wondered if you would just start by helping us with the language around wellbeing and wellness and the difference in the evolution, because I think that, you know, one of the comments that's come in already is sort of, you know, is this just repackaging some of the stuff that we already did? And I think the language is quite important.
Thanks, Beth. Yes, I've got no Sicilian connections at all. So, listening so far this morning, people are using wellness and well-being interchangeably. And that's understandable because they sound very similar. But I think there is an important distinction. And in part it's because of the genesis, but it's also because of the impact. So if you go back 15, 20 years ago, the workplace wellness movement really grew out of the USA. And it grew out of the USA because, as most people here will know, employers bear the bulk of healthcare costs in the USA, and those costs have been rising inexorably, and currently healthcare accounts for something like 17.5% of US GDP and continues to grow, and that's probably unsustainable. So companies were faced with, or are faced with, a perfect storm in a way, because the number of people with chronic diseases is increasing substantially and rapidly, and a lot of that is down to lifestyle factors. At the same time, medical treatment for those conditions is getting much better, so those people are staying alive, if one wants to be really brutal about it, longer with their chronic diseases, but are also staying in the workplace longer with their chronic diseases. And the costs of treatment, particularly for heart disease and cancer, are getting really, really expensive. And that is what's driving up healthcare costs around the world. And of course, in the US, that means costs directly borne by the employer. So, for example, 10 years ago, through the World Economic Forum, we set up a thing called the Workplace Wellness Alliance, which was dominated by US companies, and that was very much around those physical chronic diseases and what one can do as employers to try and manage those issues. Now, this side of the Atlantic, where we operate more of a social insurance model, the bulk of healthcare costs are covered through taxation, and even if you do have PMI schemes, by and large, most PMI schemes in the UK will exclude chronic diseases. So those issues around the escalating costs of particularly heart disease and cancer, of course they matter, but they matter much less to employers than they do in the States. And the big drivers of cost in the UK are musculoskeletal disorders and particularly mental health problems. So as long as I've been involved back in looking at this area, mental health has been a really important part of what we talk of as well-being. And for our colleagues over the other side of the Atlantic, they've come to that party really very late. So well-being, for me, incorporates mental health as much as an equal partner with physical health. And what we've then seen in the last few years, last 5 years, is that things have started to move out of the purely health arena. Economists have got interested. And so when you look at things that people like the OECD are doing, they're using well-being as a general framework for describing societal success. And that incorporates not just health as an outcome and as an input, but also other things like security, relationships, purpose in life. And all of those things go towards creating the improved well-being, life satisfaction, work satisfaction, happiness of people. So the language is important because the people that hear wellness, particularly if you're talking in St. Louis or somewhere, are going to think something really very different to if you say well-being in here or in Paris.
Really helpful, thank you. So thinking about that solid structure then, Melanie, it'd be great to hear about sort of how you got started in wellbeing in your organisation. And you mentioned up front, you're a Japanese company. Yeah. And so, some of the questions coming in are asking about some of the global, tying it globally as well. So it'd be good to touch on that in your answer, please.
Yeah. Basically, I have an advantage because, one, I work for a Japanese company, and Japanese companies have historically been extremely keen to look after their people. From a sociological point of view, from an employee point of view, it's a fundamental value. So they've always been quite progressive. As well as working for a Japanese company, I work for a financial services company, and financial services company have historically been quite good at putting in wellbeing programs for their staff. So although our programs evolved to encompass a lot more in the last 2 years, we've actually had most of the fundamentals that you would call a wellness program in place for 15 years. And I think a lot of the other financial services companies are similar, because I think they recognised very early on that there were certain stresses in the industry, there were long hours, there were demands on the staff, and that they had to look after their staff because it had a direct cost benefit and they could attract better people to come and work for them. So that's a big advantage. Some of the things we were talking about earlier, some of the things that I'm not sure, I know some other companies do, I don't know how familiar some of you are here with it, but our parent company, 2 or 3 years ago, if you remember, there were some quite bad earthquakes in Japan. Following the earthquakes, our parent company became extremely concerned for the well-being of all their staff worldwide and asked all the subsidiaries and branches to put in place international SOS. So international SOS basically looks after anyone, anywhere in the world, right down from being able to find a doctor for you if you've lost your medication, you're in an area where you can't speak the language, right through to actually rescuing you if you happen to be in an area where a rebellion breaks out. It will actually fly in and fly you out. And that was directly coming from the fact that they thought they hadn't got enough protection for their people following the earthquakes. So it's a very interesting dynamic, the financial services and the Japanese parent.
Thank you. Steve, it'd be great to get your reflections on sort of how your business got started in wellbeing and sort of where you've got to now at a high level.
We set the agency up in 1999, and there were 5 friends that worked at a previous agency that had lots of things in common. We enjoyed going out, we enjoyed drinking, we enjoyed playing sports, etc., etc. So the culture of the agency was natural. It felt natural to start off with because we were all like-minded individuals. As we grew, it became harder and harder to keep that culture in the same place. And then we realised it's a case of attracting the best talent in the marketplace. That's all our industry is. Our industry is getting like-minded, talented people in the same building at the same time wanting to produce brilliant advertising campaigns. And we thought it was harder and harder to do this. We weren't attracting the best talent, we weren't winning as many clients as we would have liked to have won. And then suddenly we realised we needed to look at culture, we needed to look at the organisation as a whole, we needed to make it a place where people wanted to spend their time, rather than a place where they felt as if they had to come to pick up a paycheck at the end of the month. And suddenly that penny dropping moment was probably only 5 or 6 years ago when we really realised that we needed to invest in this. We needed to invest in a strategy around well-being. We needed to find somebody who could focus on this as a full-time job, rather than somebody saying, well, why don't you do it as an HR manager? Why don't you do it as 20% of your job? It doesn't work like that. From our experience, as I said, all of you guys work in very different industries to advertising. But in our industry, we realised we needed to invest in it, not just from a financial perspective, but more from a sort of a personnel perspective, making sure we've got somebody who understands, can come up with bespoke programmes. We moved away from the classic, oh, it's a fruit bowl, let's have a fruit bowl on a Thursday, and let's give you 30% discount at a gym membership. That is rubbish, that is pointless. You are just wasting your money. What we've done is we've invested in an individual who is actually speaking later on this afternoon, a lady called Rebecca Cox. And she is at the heart of our wellbeing strategy. It's not just around fitness. Yeah, fitness is a key part of it. We have a run club, we have a softball team, we have a football team. We have 50 of the agency in London, so 15% of the agency take place in a triathlon every year, so we give them time off to train and take part in that triathlon. But more importantly, it's around individual sort of programmes, around if somebody hasn't done any sport for 5 years, it's not a case of doing a triathlon, it's a case of why don't you just do a jog around the park? So it's all around individual programmes to try and make us a more enjoyable place to work, and just as importantly, we need to be honest about this, a more attractive place to attract the best talent in our marketplace. So it's around attraction, it's around retention, and we evaluate it through levels of trust, pride, motivation and happiness. And if we are seeing improvements in those scores, those metrics, then it's far more powerful than saying we have saved £750,000 in absenteeism or whatever. For me, that doesn't wash. It has to be around pride, trust, motivation and levels of happiness, because I know if those metrics are improving, we're more profitable, we're winning more clients, and we will run an agency that is succeeding in the marketplace.
And so, Shaun, we've heard quite a lot from the panel around how actually this isn't necessarily about sort of an individual product or package, if you like. This is more about cultural implementation. And I know Royal Mail have a really strong culture around health, safety and wellbeing. Could you just draw out some of the features for us around your wellbeing strategy and things that could be helpful to others in thinking about their wellbeing journey?
Yeah. So the reason I'm smirking about the fruit bowl and litre of water is the amount of people that think that's what well-being is and wellness is. I just still find that incredible. In terms of our, the big thing for us was having a brand that people could get behind. So we have our Feeling First Class brand. So that is our health and wellbeing programme. From that, we've been able to run a series of other programmes like First Class Mental Health, First Class Wellbeing, First Class Fitness, etc., etc. Having a brand that people can associate themselves with, or the various strands, has been incredibly powerful. And it's helped me. I have this philosophy around wellbeing, which is around having a done with rather than a done to culture, because I think what you want to do is you've got to appreciate and respect that people are adults and that they are they are masters of their own destiny. And I think one of the worst things you can do is try and impose your well-being rules on them. I think the best thing is a co-creation model where you have an overarching well-being strategy where you know the areas that you want to make improvements in. In our case, it's mental health and musculoskeletal, for moving and handling. But then you work with your organisation, the people within it, the unions, etc., and come up with a strategy and a plan that everybody can get behind. And I've found that that's been much better received, much more effective. And then looking at how you can check if it's working. So in your case, using the various measures. So we use our employee opinion survey, we use anecdotal feedback, we have town hall meetings, etc. We have an app, so we've launched our Feeling First Class app where people can give us direct feedback. Because I think you've got to, or certainly in my view, is you've got to keep fresh and keep moving and keep challenging yourself. It's very, very similar. My background was health and safety. The kind of well-being thing is a new area in recent years, but it's exactly the same as health and safety for me. It's a done with, not a done to. It's much more collaborative, and it's about setting a vision that you want for the future and staying on the front foot, so always looking and learning, shamelessly stealing ideas from other people, shamelessly sharing ideas with other people, and really appreciating that it's not that there's no shame in sharing ideas. In fact, I would really actively encourage it, and take feedback from your recipients, so from the beneficiaries of your service. Get frontline feedback from them and let them tell you what's working, what's not working. And that in turn creates a positive culture. So if somebody was to say to me then, well, prove it, the example would be our employee opinion survey. Our wellbeing score has gone up 2 points every year, which is a big deal for us. 2 points every year since we introduced Feeling First Class.
And so you've all touched on some really important features of strong wellbeing strategies there, almost like you know what you're doing, which is brilliant. So we've got engagement, we've got the role of digital, employee feedback, culture. But I don't want to sidestep the question that has 13 likes, as many as I get on an Instagram, 13 likes about how can we calculate the return on investment. And I think this is a question we talked about before briefly because it comes up a lot. And it is often met with groans, and we can talk about that in our response perhaps, but I suspect the reason people ask the question is they're trying to get a budget to get started. And so does anyone have any comments on how to answer that ROI question, and then taking a slightly different shift on it in terms of how do you get budget to get started?
So I'll happily jump in. So I'm part of the Business in the Community Work Well leadership team, and we're doing some work specifically on ROI there, specifically. So that there's a guy in GSK who's taking a lead on that, but we're rolling that out across the work that we're doing within Royal Mail as well, and in other areas. So watch this space, because there is going to be some published literature on that later on this year that will be freely available on the Business in the Community website. That's point one. Secondly, in terms of return on investment, there's the point you made about absence and absenteeism. We do actually use absenteeism and absence costs as a way of looking at our wellbeing spend and our return on investment. So you say you're not a big fan of it. We actually use that as one of the ways of triangulating our measures and looking at success. It's not the be-all and end-all, but we do look at that. As I said, then we look at other softer measures like the employee opinion survey. In terms of getting investment into wellbeing, personally, I don't think it always has to be big bucks. I think you can get small wins from smaller budget early on, and let it build up its own head of steam. I'm really lucky that I work in an organisation where we've got a really top level commitment from our board and from our chief executive and from our group HR director. So I do get spend and I do get budget allocated to it. But I have worked in other organisations, where I worked in construction and waste, where it was tough, and actually what we did was we tried to build up a head of steam by using our own people to kind of create some kind of wellbeing tension, like you said, around competitions, walks, runs around the park, etc., and build up some momentum and get other people to see the value that it gives, and then that kind of gets them to loosen the purse strings a little bit, in my experience.
I think it's a really tough one. And what I say about that, in terms of trying to prove the value of investment in well-being, it is really hard, and there will be people who have different metrics, there are people who will prove it in slightly different ways. I think if the board doesn't fundamentally believe that fitness, well-being, wellness, looking after your staff is of critical importance to the success of the business, you are fighting a losing battle, because it's very difficult to actually have a justifiable, well, from my experience, we spend £5, we get £50,000 back in terms of return on investment. It is the intangible factors, and we're very lucky because the executive board are not just believers in this, we're participants in it. So we are the first on the football field on a Monday afternoon, we're the first when it comes to a seminar around dietary requirements and the areas of sort of stress and well-being. So we fundamentally believe in it, and I think that just trickles down, so suddenly everybody feels comfortable about taking an hour out at 3 o'clock in the afternoon to go for a walk in the park, to do a yoga class in the office, because that is led by the front from those people that are running the company, and I think that makes a fundamental difference to the way that this should be treated.
I think if you're not careful, obsessing about ROI can lead you down a dangerous path, because what it tends to draw you into is single initiatives that you're measuring the impact of and trying to assign some sort of usually financial value to those. And what then tends to happen is those initiatives run out of steam, they stop delivering the benefits, or they deliver diminishing benefits, and the whole thing grinds to a halt. People just get bored, or people move on. You have to have a framework. Call it a strategy if you like. We call it a framework because I think strategy sounds pompous. But a strategy, or a framework rather, that looks at the different elements that you need to influence in order to gain traction. And if you take a public health model, then you have primary prevention, you have secondary intervention, and you have tertiary rehabilitation or restitution. And if you adopt that sort of model and you think about what are the things that we need to do to prevent problems in the first place, what are the things that we need to do to intervene at the first sign that things are going wrong, what are the things that we need to do when things have gone wrong and people have become unwell. If you adopt that sort of framework, then you can put in place measures that over the longer term will show you how you're doing as an organisation. And I think Steve's absolutely right. You have to have your senior leadership bought into the principle that well-being of your people is an important thing to do. It does deliver business benefits, but it's also the right thing to do. And certainly with our board, what they want to see is that it washes its face in financial terms. But there's a bigger prize, and that's about creating the sort of workplace that people want to come to, all the things we've heard about, attracting talent, but also critically creating an environment in which we work for our customers, and our customers want to come back to us because they're dealing with people that feel good about life. So there are all sorts of things that one can throw into the pot in terms of making the argument, but please don't get sucked into this self-defeating argument of single initiatives with we'll spend X, we'll get back 4X, because it just doesn't work.
So we heard some important features there around getting senior leader buy-in, around shamelessly stealing best practice from elsewhere and sharing ideas with others, measurement. One of the questions that's very popular on Slido is, I guess, thinking about, so maybe you've established that in the hub, your main office, but how do you then take that elsewhere? And Melanie, you and I were talking about that beforehand, so I'd be interested in your thoughts of being very transparent about the challenges of doing that and where you've seen success.
There are, the way we're actually structured, not the group, but the securities part that we actually work for, is we're a subsidiary, which means that we're the largest subsidiary in London, which means that we actually drive a lot of things from here, but they're not, it's not a branch, so it's not just implemented everywhere else. We have to influence other areas or show them what we're doing or cascade things down, or they'll ask us what we're doing and we'll share and give the benefits. So, but being the largest one, we're fortunate because we drive most things from London. But it is difficult in terms of some of the benefits and things, or some of the gym memberships or things we do here, depending on whether you're in India or in Germany, where there's a very different benefit system. You can't offer them the same things because they pay for it through the state, so it's more of a financial benefit. So we have to adapt it, but lots of the fundamental core things we do are applicable to all our people that might be in different subsidiaries, but employed by us in London, such as our German office, where we still run, they can still come and have financial workshops, they can still be involved in. One of the things that I think is really good for engagement, which we haven't spoken about yet, is as well as all of the physical initiatives and the clubs and the annual health checks and things, we've found that what made our employees feel really good is to get very involved in selecting a charity and then become very involved in charitable initiatives. So, we'll fund them to go for a day to our charity and as a team and do things for the charity. And in terms of engagement and well-being, that's had an enormous impact. And we measure by all the normal measures. We do measure by sickness. We're a bank, we measure everything. But one of the things in terms of engagement we found is being able to give something back has made a massive difference. Being able to have that time off to go and give something back has really engaged people in the whole well-being aspect. The last thing I'd quickly say is there was a speaker earlier who said, some companies don't like to talk about stress. We actually run workshops where we say how to recognise signs of stress, and for managers, how to recognise when your people are becoming stressed. So we will actually promote them understanding what stress is before it becomes a mental health issue. We also run the, what is mental health? Everyone suffers from it. Making it the norm to talk about mental health. But at the very early stages, we do run stress workshops. So we're not frightened of using the word stress.
So sticking on that theme of engagement, before we talk about the employee side, because I think that's very key, one of the questions that was asked at the start of this session was, do your board lead by example? And so to inspire us about what that looks like, does anyone want to share how they try and lead by example in this space, and or things they've seen, their peers on the board do that's been very effective?
I was going to say, we in HR, I've been to the stress awareness sessions. I totally recognise that just because we happen to be in senior roles or in HR, we get equally stressed in our role. And I very much encourage my team to say, I need to do that session, or I'm feeling symptoms of this and I need to go and understand how to manage it and, get some wellbeing tips. So we do go to all the courses we run and, and tell people we're going to them and talk to people on them quite openly as a delegate of the course.
Shaun?
So safety, health and wellbeing is situated within HR, within Royal Mail. So we do those sorts of things. So we kind of walk the talk firstly. We get involved actively in the pilot programme. So we did 5 videos where we work with the Mental Health Foundation on recognising signs of stress, how to manage them, etc., etc. And we had people from the organisation, from my team, from the front line, senior management, be interviewed as part of those videos, so they were kind of actively leading. Then there's a kind of personal thing that we do, so in terms of getting involved in sharing our own personal kind of stories in terms of exercise and fitness. I was 20% body fat in November, and now I'm 13%. And they're sick of hearing me, but I keep telling them every time I see them, talk to them about how much running I've done, and they're the same. We all share a bit of friendly competition in terms of the things that we've been doing ourselves, and recognising our own contribution, that we can share our own health stories, share our own wellbeing stories, and create a culture where people talk about it a lot more openly, really.
It's a really interesting point you raise about storytelling, because I think in mental health, where I've really seen it unlock that discussion with leaders, is where they hear somebody talk about their experience, being in business, suffering from mental ill health, getting the support they need, and then coming back and being successful. And so for anyone that's sort of thinking about that, there are a number of organisations that support people in how to think about sharing their story. So Mind, City Mental Health Alliance is another one that I'm involved with. So if you Google that, you'll come across a video of senior leaders talking about why mental health is so important in their workplaces, but also some very senior people sharing their personal stories. And that sort of can be very effective in inspiring leaders to speak up, because peer pressure is a wonderful tool that we should definitely make use of in business.
I think the only other thing that I would say to that is it's critically important for the board to be actively participating in this. It's also critical that the agency or the organisation doesn't feel as though it's a top-down strategy. Because if that is the case, they're just sitting there waiting for what's the next thing that's going to happen, what are you going to do next as a board. So we actively encourage the agency as a whole to come up with innovative, clever ideas that can suddenly create a more engaged, more exciting, better organisation. Quite interestingly, yesterday I had the MD of our office in Amsterdam, was over in the UK, and he presented an idea where he wants to do a Top Gear type challenge. We've got an office in Munich, an office in London, and an office in Amsterdam in Europe. So he wants to create a team of 12 people from each of those agencies to cycle from London to Munich and Amsterdam to Munich, and it's about the same amount of miles. And suddenly that's not going to be the fittest getting fitter. That's going to be people within the agency, whether they haven't been on a bike for 10 years or whether they're doing whatever 100 miles over a weekend. And that type of thing makes me feel as though it's not costing the agency really any money at all. And we're actually going to be raising money for local charities in those three markets. So that for me is so important, the fact that it's felt from the bottom up as well as the top down, because otherwise I feel as though it will fail.
I think that's really important, provided, and it's a big provided, that there's coherence and authenticity. So it's great when you get a senior leader who does something like that, or does a triathlon or whatever. But if they do that on one hand, and then in the day-to-day job, there's a bullying culture that grinds people down, then I'm afraid they lose authenticity. I think it can be counterproductive. So there has to be coherence, and the people doing it have to bear in mind that authenticity in this area is absolutely critical.
And so, sorry to interrupt, we've been given our time warning. And so I want to make sure that we get those small nuggets of really practical advice from you all. So I'm going to ask each of you, for someone sat in the audience that has either got nothing and is trying to think about getting started, assuming they've got very little resources so far, what advice would you give to that person in about 30 seconds? Paul, let's kick off with you, if that's okay.
Start with a framework. So remember that primary, secondary, tertiary. If you then think about create a 9-box grid, managers love 9-box grids. So primary, secondary, tertiary, you then have how you're going to assess, how you're going to educate, and any products or services that you want to put in place. Create that 9-box grid. Look at what you already have. You'll have a lot. Put something in each of those boxes. Where you've got gaps, that's where you focus your effort. So have a framework and keep it practical.
Brilliant. Melanie?
Sorry, totally agree with the framework, but I was just thinking, if you're, as an easy, quick fix, if you haven't got any money and you're trying to persuade your board, then try and use some of the suppliers that will come in and do things, so mortgage advisors, and try and bring people in that will give your employees something that are going to be minimal cost at the beginning, obviously under the framework you've already put together.
I would say it's not a one-night stand. You can't think of this as let's do this something for the next 3 months and expect it to make a big difference. It's a longer-term strategy. You have to create that budget. It doesn't have to be a huge budget, but that budget has to be sacrosanct. You need to say, we're not going to suddenly take that away if our performance starts to dip. You need to invest in it in the long term. And the final point is get somebody who can actually focus on this. Just expecting somebody to do it as a part-time job, it is not going to work. The only reason it's worked for us is because we've gone out, we've found somebody who understands our culture, our organisation, and is brilliant at bringing all of those things together.
My piece of advice would be to give it a brand, to give it an identity that pulled all those things together. So you have a strategy, you have a plan, you have some resource, you have some finances allocated to it, but with a brand and an identity to it, and make it a sustainable brand. Try and come up with something that can have arms and legs, that you can, so it doesn't become the one night stand or the flavour of the month, and have it as an identity that gets people talking about it, and that will create its own momentum and its own interest.
Super. Well, thank you all very much. And I think the only thing I would add is speak to each other, share ideas, because quite often the best ideas come from someone that's tried it already. You know, they've learned the challenges, they know what works, and that's the question that you ask, you know, us as the market the most, what works? So let's, you know, share that today in the networking, and thank you for your attention and questions, and thank you very much to the panel for that great insight.